we're creating a testing input to using the get method, sending data over to the server. So we're going to use JavaScript to generate some input fields and be able to click on that. And then this is actually being submitted to the server. And this is the URL that's being submitted to the server. And the server is responding with the JSON data that's being returned back. And then what we're doing with the JSON data is we're outputting it on the page. So a simple testing application to test connections and simulate submitting input content to a server, and then also handling the response data that came back from fetch. The endpoint that we're going to be connecting to, so this is going to be Google user content. So it's a Google script that's running, and what it's going to be doing is it's going to be returning back either the get or the post data that we're submitting to it. And it's just going to be simply returning it back and responding back with the same data that we're adding to it. And we can pick that up and then use that within the JavaScript. So the endpoint is rather long. I'm going to post it into the JavaScript code under the web URL. So const URL. And we're going to actually update this and we'll say base URL. And then the base URL is going to be the endpoint that we're going to use and make the connection to. Also going to save this and update the toggle view. And this actually should be HTTPS to make the connection to the endpoint. So the data right now, you're not going to see anything on this endpoint. If we do submit to the endpoint, and if we do something like ID equals 99, it's going to be a JSON object that just has the content that we've submitted. So we can use this for testing and testing out, sending different method requests, and also picking up input field values to send to the server. And this is going to be simulating the server picking up the information, and it's going to just respond back to the same request information that we've sent. So we're going to remove out the window add event listener, as we're going to be relying on this as a click event. So picking up data from the web page, from the input fields, and then sending that over using the base URL and applying and appending to that. So first we'll try using a fetch or a get method, and we'll just create a function called get data. So this will actually send the request over, and I'll add in the URL. So let's construct the URL using the base URL and then adding to it. And the request parameters, just going to have ID equals 100. And we can have a number of different parameters here. And we want to return this information back to our web application. So it's going to make the full round trip to the server. Server is going to respond back with the data within a JSON format. And passing in the URL. So we'll pick up the URL within the get data function. And here is where we can use the URL and make a fetch request. So once we've got the response object, return back the response as JSON. So the endpoint is going to be sending it as JSON data. And then we get the data contents back. And for now, we'll log it out into the console. And then we can also update on the page as well. So let's click the button. And we're sending over to the server. The server is responding with the request parameters. So let's go ahead and add in a few more input fields. And I'm going to use a for loop. And we're going to construct a bunch of input fields and add them to the page within the output area. So while I is less than 10, increment I plus 1. And we'll just create an input field using the document, create element. And the element that we're creating is going to be input. Set the attribute. And let's select the input first. And set its attribute. So setting the type. And set the type as text. and then we'll take output and append the newly created myInput. Let's also add in a few other attributes so that we could distinguish them on the page. So the other attribute that we might want to add is placeholder, and the value for placeholder, and we can have value plus I, so that will output a bunch of input fields on the page. Also for the myInput, using class list, let's add and a class of box to it. And let's go back into the styling. We'll create the box class. So this is going to be for the inputs. We'll use a display block so the input takes up the full width, and have it a width of 80%. So that generates a bunch of the input fields. Also, we'll do a margin and auto to center the content. And I'll also make the font size bigger. So there we go. So we've got all of the inputs that are generated on the page. And also let's take the button and we'll move it to the bottom of all the other inputs. So we can do that. We can move the element on the page by appending it. So we take the button and append it to the bottom of all the inputs, and then also apply the box styling to the button. So button class list, and let's add the class of box. So that will take full width across. And we can also append and add a class to the original input that we had on the page. So I'm just restyling it and adding some input fields. And we might also want to populate it with a value. So we can set the value of that myInput and update the value. And I'll use the same thing that I had for the placeholder. So that populates it all with values. The original input, let's set a value for that as well. So that can be hello world. Also, let's give these inputs and set attribute. And the attribute that we're going to set is going to be the name attribute. And how about we just list it out as name plus, and we'll do I plus 1. So they all have unique name values to them. And open it and do a quick code inspect and see what we've got for the code. So we've got number of inputs, and they all have unique names associated with it. And I'll also update the input element with an attribute of name, as we're going to use the names for the property names that we're going to be sending over to the server. So we've got a name, and I'll call it OG for the original. So all of the input fields are here. We can also look specifically for ones that are within the output area. And if we want to move the original input within the output field, we can do that as well with an append. So that will have everything within that main output container. So let's go back into the console. And when we click the button, we want to get all of the values, and we want to pass all of that information on within the fetch request. So when we get the data, we need to construct the URL that we're sending the request to. So let's make an update of that data. And we have to string it together the same way that we've got the URL. So we've got the original base URL. And then we're going to add and append to it. So making a selection, I'll just give it a plural of L's. And using the output and then query selector, we're going to do a query selector all, selecting all of the elements, the input fields. And let's do a loop through, so else for each, and it's going to produce the element. And once we've got the element, then using the curly brackets, we're going to update the base URL. And let's take the element content and see what we get back for name. So we get all of the names that are associated, and also we can get the element value. So what we need to do is append it to the URL. So let's create a temporary holder for that. And I'm using the backticks. So we're just going to add it onto the base URL. So using the element name, and then adding to it, so element name is going to equal to whatever we've got for the element value. So it's going to construct our web URL and add to the URL the value of temp. So we also need to append it with an AND, so that we can add multiple values together. So we can have the AND at the end, so that we still have the same format for the URL. And before we send the URL, we'll post it into the console. So let's see what we got now. So we were successfully able to send the information in, and one of the problems was that we just ended up sending a blank entry, and that's because we had the AND sign at the end, and that understood it as that's going to be another name with a value, but it didn't have any name or value associated with it. So a better way to construct this is to create a temporary array. So I'll do that and just create a temporary array. And then as we add and update, we can get rid of the AND sign and take the temporary array and push into it the value of temp. And then when we're ready to build the web URL, we can append to the web URL. And let's create my, I'll just call it request URL. We're going to use the temporary array that we've added all the items to, and then join. And what join will do is, this is an array method that converts an array into a string format. So we need to join it together, and the default joiner is going to be a comma. So if we don't want to use the comma, we can specify how we want to join the array content. And I'm going to use the AND symbol in order to join it together. And now when we try it out, and actually I need to update this, and we'll try it out one more time. So this way, we were able to create all of the request parameters, and we didn't have any spaces, so we didn't have any extra ones there. So we're able to successfully send the information over, and we see that information is being returned back as JSON data. So let's iterate through the JSON data. And this is actually going to be an object that's being returned back. So we can loop through the object data and output it to the page. Let's create a second output area, and I'll call it output 1. And using document create element, this is going to be a blank div, and it'll serve as our holder for getting the data that's being returned back from the server. So output 1, and it doesn't actually have to hold anything, so we can just simply append it to the output. And I'm going to append it at the end of output below the button. And pending output 1. And then when we generate the page, so outputting the object, and we're going to pass in one parameter is going to be the object. So we want to loop through and get all of the object values. So using the for in statement, we're going to iterate through all of the properties that we've got within the current object and then output them to the page. So selecting output, and let's add the inner HTML, so clear out any existing content that's there. And then using the for in statement, selecting the property in the object. And as we loop through, first we can console log it out just to make sure that we're picking up everything properly. I use the backticks. So let's see what we've got for property. And then let's see what we've got for the object value. So using the bracket notation, we're going to include the property, so the key value, and then the value that we're outputting into the console, and we go down. And remember, this is data that's being returned back from the server. So we're using that data and then we're just looping through it. So let's update the contents of the inner HTML of output with those values that we've just produced. And let's try it out. So we're doing a round trip to the server with the content that is sitting on within our input fields. So looping through, so if we make any updates to the input fields, it's going to update the content that's being output and received back from the server. Let's create, I'll just create another class called main, and I'll make the font size small on this one and add in a border so that we can distinguish the new content that's come in. And then as well, let's add in some padding. So adding in the class of main to the output. So let's take output 1 and using class list add the class of main. And let's see what that looks like. So that outputs all of the values that we have within the input fields. So it's just a way to test and making requests. So coming up, we're also going to be doing this with post and getting the form data and simulating a post to the server. So that's coming up next. Tasks for this lesson are to create some input fields, so have some values in those fields, and then create the submit action, then sending the data over to the server from the input fields. So using fetch, send the input field data to the server, and then handle the response back from the server, which is going to be a JSON object. So taking the data, the JSON data, and outputting it for the user.